And greetings to everybody. Today's seminar, Biological Risks and Hazards in the World Today, with a special focus on Russia and Ukraine, is part of the ISA and Academy of Political Science History and Future of Planetary Risks series. By that we mean that is catastrophic risks and hazards are dealt with in the following domains: geological, infectious disease, biological, environmental, chemical, extreme weather, radiological, and nuclear, or combinations of these. This is the content in which the series deals with. By catastrophic, we mean classes of events that could lead to sudden, extraordinary, widespread disaster beyond the collective capacity of national and international organizations and the private sector to control, causing severe disruptions in normal social functioning, heavy tolls in mortality and morbidity, major economic losses, in some events that may well alter the direction of history. And with that, as background to say that today we're focusing on biological risks and hazards, we will touch on chemical as well. The first speakers to essentially lay the groundwork for today are Jessica Bell and Hayley and Severance. Jessica is a senior director for the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Global Biological Policy and Programs team. In this role, she leads the Global Health Security Index, an assessment and benchmarking of 195 countries and their national health security capacities. She is joined by Hayley and Severance, who is the Deputy Vice President of the same NTI entity and program. In that role, she supports and leads the team's effort to reduce biological risks that imperil humanity. Thank you to both of you for doing the first presentation, dealing with the health security environment across post-Soviet states. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Wilmot, and thank you for having us here today. And we look forward to a productive discussion among this very distinguished group. So as Wilmot mentioned, I'm Hayley Severance, the Vice President of the Biological Policy and Programs team at NTI, and I'm joined by my colleague, Jessica Bell, Senior Director and co-lead of the Global Health Security Index. And for those unfamiliar, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and let me share my slides, is a okay, just want to confirm you can all see those.
We see this presenter view rather than the slide itself.
Okay, hopefully you can see that now.
We still see just the presenter view.
Okay, I'll try to fix it. But the Nuclear Threat Initiative is a nonprofit, nonpartisan global security organization focused on reducing nuclear and biological threats that imperil humanity. We are, and on the NTI Bio team, we address biological threats across the spectrum, whether they be natural, intentional, or deliberate in origin. And this is really given their potential to kill millions and cost billions globally. Our work really centers around three broad mission areas: countering catastrophic biological risks, which includes preventing biotechnology catastrophe, strengthening biosecurity and pandemic preparedness, and building accountability for global health security progress. So before we dive in, I just want to do a quick slide check. Can you see these now? All right, I see thumbs up, so I think we're good. So before we dive into the current health security environment across the 15 countries that comprise the post-Soviet states, we thought it'd be useful to provide a brief, very high-level history of the public health systems in those states and the transformation they underwent following the fall of the Soviet Union. And for this section and for this presentation, I'll focus on the anti-plague system because it really was the focus of activities it really was the focus of activities that dealt with especially dangerous pathogens, which is often the type of work that falls at this intersection of health and security. So prior to 1991, 92, so the Soviet Union fell in December of 91, the Soviet anti-plague system was really designed as a hierarchical network of civilian facilities whose mission was really to control and prevent the importation of disease within the Soviet Union. This involved mostly surveillance and biological research activities, all in the pursuit of protecting their population against infectious disease threats. And it was really considered to be quite effective. It was also considered to be part of the Soviet biodefense program, codenamed Problem 5, to defend against biological attacks. So being able to detect those attacks early. But then in the 1960s, the Soviet offensive biological weapon program began to task the anti-plague system. And in the 70s, the anti-plague system was considered to be an active contributor, at least in part, to the offensive program known as Ferment. So then moving into post-fall of the Soviet Union, there was obviously a fragmentation of this anti-plague system and public health systems in general when the newly independent or post-Soviet states were formed. In some countries, attempts were made to actually fold the anti-plague system under what they call their sanitary epidemiological system, but there were concerns that the special knowledge that the anti-plague system had around what they call especially dangerous pathogens may be lost in kind of this folding under kind of broader systems. So during this time, overall funding for our infrastructure and personnel decreased significantly, threatening the safety and security of the work being done, and including potential unauthorized access to pathogen stores. There were also concerns about dual-use knowledge among now very poorly paid staff, making them attractive targets for criminal or terrorist activity. And importantly, the ability of the anti-plague system to conduct surveillance
Hayley, you're frozen if you can hear us.
Maybe I can jump in her stead while she reconnects.
Good idea. Go ahead.
All right, great. So as Hayley was saying, there has been efforts in the intervening years to kind of rebuild this overall health systems within these specific countries. And this is credit both to the nations themselves, but also for their own investments, but also to the nations that have given credit for certain collaborative programs. So thinking the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program that sought to build out these capabilities and to address some of the vulnerabilities that she described. However, as we move more to the present, the vulnerabilities within the system remain, and that's the focus of the topic that I want to talk about with the Global Health Security Index. It's essentially a benchmarking of 195 countries and their national level health security capacities. Kind of think of it as a dashboard of risk. So it's looking at existing capacities. We first published the Global Health Security Index in 2019, and it was published just before COVID really took the global stage. Our findings from this report were such that basically it showed an alarming set of data. Scores were very low, showing gaps across the pandemic preparedness spectrum. And even among the highest scoring countries like the US, we saw severe gaps in national level preparedness. Fast forward to 2021, December 2021, we published our second report, and we were able to compare these two sets of data and see how countries improved over time. And even given the response to COVID and the innate or organic capacities that were built up, we continue to see significant weaknesses in preparedness. And I'd like to step back and just share some of the framework of our index. And I'm just going to share slides real quickly. Basically, what we're seeing with the index is a structure of 6 categories. It's 3 of the more, I would say, traditional prevention, detection, and response, but then also looking at enabling characteristics of measurement. So global commitments, financing, looking at health systems, and then looking at risk. And as part of this effort, we have collected about over 60,000 data points. In 2021, we actually expanded the number of questions that we were looking at. There were a lot of lessons learned coming out of COVID and feedback that we had received since 2019. And we wanted to make sure that we incorporated some of those lessons learned by expanding the questions that we were asking. It's important to emphasize here that we pulled this data, it was observable data, meaning it was from publicly available data sources. And looking at the additional questions that we added, we wanted to make sure that we're continuing to emphasize transparency here. That is incredibly critical in the aggregation of this data and making it available to the wider public. Some of the additional questions that we did incorporate into the 2021 index looked at scaling of laboratories, supply chain. That became very critical, especially early on in COVID. We looked at risk communications and more, or I would say more nuanced measurements as it relates to the political and security measures. And so essentially, what did this tell us? Overall, there's been little progress at the global level. So the overarching average score is still very low, 38.9 out of a possible 100. What you see here on the screen is that global picture. Essentially, the darker the color, the better, the greater number of existing capacities for that country. 118 of 195 countries actually scored in the bottom 2 tiers, and not a single country scored in our top tier. I'll dive into this in a little bit more of detail, but I wanted to specifically highlight some of the measures that we incorporate here. I mentioned the 6 categories. We drill down into more specific indicators or sub-indicators related to biosafety, biosecurity, prevention, and detection. And so this next slide is going to give you a little bit more of a better view. So essentially, overall score, not even a 40 out of 100. For the post-Soviet states, we actually saw the average around that same scoring, 41 out of 100. Prevention specifically, and these are 3 categories that I'm highlighting here. Overall, you're not seeing a lot of change. It looks fairly static in that the coloring is similar across these 3 views. The bottom of the screen is going to show your overall scores and how those buckets of the countries lay out as far as existing capacities. Prevention was our lowest scoring category in general, so across all countries within the index. And this includes measures like antimicrobial resistance, zoonotic diseases, biosafety and biosecurity, and then also looking at dual use research of concern. A few key points there that I referenced earlier is that most of the countries that we saw here for the post-Soviet states lacked evidence of biosecurity and biosafety training and practices using a more standardized method. It also looked at, specific to these states, is the dual use research oversight and essentially a culture of responsible science. This is an incredibly low score. It was only a 4 out of a possible 100. But to be fair, across all countries globally, it was one of the lowest scores within the index. When we look at detection, again, we see about a score of 40 out of 100, and this takes into account laboratory system strength, supply chains, surveillance and reporting, data accessibility, and then also looking at case-based investigations and the epidemiological workforce. We saw significant gaps here in the current data set as far as surveillance and reporting, and then low scores and laboratory supply chains for this grouping of countries. And then lastly here on the scores response, this takes into consideration emergency preparedness and response planning. It looks at emergency response operations. Another critical component is linking public health and security authorities and risk communications. Access to communications infrastructure is also an important portion of this response category. And one key highlight here is in the lowest score across all indicators for these post-Soviet states was in communications with healthcare workers during a public health emergency. In addition to that, it was a very low score in the public healthcare spending levels per capita. So this is just a picture of 3 of the 6 categories of measures we've captured. But for the index writ large, we look at 195 countries. So essentially the members to the international health regulations. And I think an important point here is to relay that we look at this in an absolute scale. So while it's 170 questions that we ask and score individually, we see this as any one capacity could have catastrophic events towards the prevention and response to the next pandemic. Each of these capacities is critical, and so understanding where those gaps are is really important. That leads me to what were our findings for 2021. Essentially, we're looking at a fairly stark picture as far as the lack in preparedness, particularly in a few key areas like the robustness in health systems, addressing vulnerable populations, and then the political and security risks impacting, for instance, the provision of services and financing against the next pandemic. Our data around longer term financing for pandemic preparedness showed some pretty critical gaps here. And this underpins all the other findings, because without the resources to address the capacities, there would be little or no movement by governments or donors or regional or international bodies and the private sector to address these gaps. So overall, the data shows gaps in these abilities of specifically of the post-Soviet countries and their neighbors to prevent and detect biological events, especially from accidents or deliberate misuse. And this is a risk which has been rising due to the current political context. And I think if Hayley has rejoined us, I will pass it over to you, Hayley.
Thank you, and apologies. We had a bad storm last night, and I think that's impacting my internet connection for some reason. So hopefully I can remain on, and thanks, Jess, for picking back up. So yeah, the political insecurity environment laying that backdrop, I think we're all pretty well aware of the ongoing disinformation campaign that Russia is employing, including falsely claiming that animal and public health biological research facilities are secretly being used to build bioweapons, relying on support from the US and other countries. This is not a new tactic, but has been somewhat effective in sowing division and confusion, especially when the propaganda is parroted by other countries and news outlets. It also creates an environment where Russia could be seen as justified in the future illicit use of these weapons. And so the risk of deliberate spread is worrisome and has potential really to become a global threat, especially given the vulnerabilities that the index highlighted in health security capabilities in post-Soviet states, but also globally. So next slide, please. And I'll touch on this briefly, but it's also concerning that our global systems lack the authorities and agility to respond to these emerging risks. The latest highlighted in March 2022 when High Representative for Disarmament Izumi Nakamitsu addressed the UN Security Council in response to Russian allegations of the existence of biological weapons in Ukraine. In addition to stating she's not aware of any such programs, she took the time to note that the UN currently has neither the mandate nor the technical nor operational capacity to investigate this information, highlighting risks in our global systems. Next slide, please. So the challenges that we've described throughout this presentation are summarized here, specific to the post-Soviet states, but also with global implications. The geopolitical context and associated risks in the region can really challenge short and long-term preparedness. And this lack of preparedness can also challenge immediate prevention and response efforts. A lack of international verification and investigation protocols have been exploited in this case to sow distrust and may be signs of the potential rising risks of an intentional use scenario, which would be very concerning. A lack of investment has negatively impacted preparedness levels in countries that have already been suffering from fragmentation of their systems and are most likely to be impacted should this risk of a deliberate event eventually become a reality. And finally, and this is more forward-looking and will be touched on more by Greg, but we also had to be looking at what risks loom on the horizon beyond today, what's occurring in today's risk environment, and had to be aware that rapid biotechnology advances are currently outpacing national governments' ability to provide oversight to prevent accidents or deliberate misuse. I'll turn over to Jessica for our last slide.
It's nice to end on an optimistic note, especially since I've highlighted so many of the gaps. So here we have a lot of opportunities to address these challenges. First, national governments have to look at the foundational elements. These are things that build trust in a system. So for instance, the provision of access to healthcare, transparency of data, and communications with your populations, as well as commitments towards the longer planning of emergency response and financing to critical in building out these capacities and creating trust in the system. Second, I think we need to build stronger global systems that address the spectrum of biological threats. The international community needs to establish an effective verification mechanism for the Biological and Toxins Weapons Convention, so the BWC. And this mechanism also needs to be grounded in transparency in order to prevent further spread of dis and misinformation. All of these parties working together towards common aims, that makes us all safer. And we have an opportunity to do this at the upcoming BWC RevCon. Third, the index showed us that globally, longer-term financing is weak. And in order to make sure that those gaps in health security are addressed, financing for pandemic preparedness has to be prioritized. And this needs to be done with consistent multi-year funding across all countries. And we see progress with this in the global conversation around the Financial Intermediary Fund that can help to address some of these pandemic preparedness gaps. And then finally, ensuring that the world continues to benefit from bioscience advances. We need to protect the global research and development enterprise. This is protection from catastrophic accidents or deliberate misuse, and building a stronger biosecurity and biosafety systems at all levels. This includes the strengthening of biosecurity norms and in developing innovative but practical tools and incentives to uphold them. So with that, Dr. James, I will pass it back to you and thank you for this time.
Thank you very much to Jessica Bell and Hayley Severance for laying the groundwork. Just to mention that there are two bodies of metrics that we regard as credible for assessing risk and hazards. The first is the WHO's JEE metrics base, but that is based on voluntary cooperation, so it doesn't cover the entire globe. But the Global Health Security Index does. So for all 195 countries, and for those who are interested in doing a deeper dive on this issue, please look at that at the index. It is a remarkable database. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over straight away to Gregory Koblentz, who is an associate professor and a director of the Biodefense Graduate Program at George Mason's University in the Shah School of Policy and Government. Greg is an expert in this area. He's going to talk about the evolving biosecurity landscape today. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you very much, Wilmot. Pleasure to be here with everybody. I'm going to zoom out a bit and take more of a global approach to the challenges we're facing in the biosecurity realm, because we're facing a much more complex and complicated environment than ever before. COVID-19 has dramatically demonstrated the power of pandemics to impact every facet of our lives, our societies, and our economies. And while the pandemic was most likely caused by a natural zoonotic spillover event, it has also highlighted the risks posed by human-made biological threats. And ironically, the greater efforts we're now investing to prevent future pandemics and to strengthen biopreparedness could inadvertently lead to increased risks of accidental or deliberate pandemics occurring. Meanwhile, our biorisk management policies are failing to keep up with these new threats, as Jessica and Hayley just described. So today I'm going to describe 10 trends that are shaping the biorisk landscape that were underway before COVID-19, but have really been accelerated by the pandemic. And to meet this challenge, we're going to need to strengthen biorisk management at the national and international level to deal with both field biosafety, laboratory biosafety, laboratory biosecurity, and oversight of abuse research, with the overall goal of reducing the risk posed by biological threats resulting from the accidental, reckless, or deliberate misuse of biotechnology. So the first trend is the increased number of maximum containment laboratories around the world. And these are the labs that are designed to handle and conduct research on the most dangerous pathogens known to humanity. Research I'm conducting with Philippa Lentzos at King's College London has identified 60 such labs in operation, planned, or under construction in 23 countries. Most of these labs are located in urban areas, and only a quarter of the countries that house these labs have scored highly on measures of biosafety and biosecurity, such as those found in NTI's Global Health Security Index. Furthermore, since the start of the pandemic, we have seen signs that there are further 20 BSL-4 labs planned for construction, and most of these have been announced by Russia. Now, there are international standards for biorisk management, but they're not widely adopted, and there's no mechanism, no international mechanism for ensuring compliance of labs with these standards. The second trend is the growth in high risk and gain of function research. The pandemic is likely going to increase the number of laboratories and scientists engineering viruses to have enhanced virulence or transmissibility compared to naturally occurring strains. This is colloquially called gain of function research, and it's motivated by a desire to better understand how easily these viruses can infect human cells, which is indicative of the ability of this virus to jump from animals to humans and spread to human and potentially cause pandemics, as we're witnessing today. We saw a similar increase in this type of gain of function research following the flu pandemics in 2005 with avian influenza and the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. This research led to the creation, for example, of a strain of H5N1 avian influenza that could be transmitted between mammals, something that the wild type virus could not do. We know there's currently at least one lab in the United States that's trying to add genetic material from the original SARS virus to SARS-CoV-2 to create a chimeric strain of the two viruses. Unfortunately, oversight of gain of function research in the United States has been very problematic so far, but it's simply non-existent in most other countries. The third trend is the growth in large-scale viral prospecting, because research activities outside of laboratories are also increasing risks. For example, last year, USAID launched a new $125 million program for viral characterization targeting Southeast Asia. Chinese researchers have also called for more field research to improve their ability to predict the risk of zoonotic spillover events. And the growth in this large-scale viral prospecting to identify potential pandemic pathogens in the wild increases the risk that researchers will become infected while collecting biomedical or environmental samples in the field and handling wild animals. The emergence of SARS, MERS, and SARS-CoV-2 have already demonstrated that such viruses are currently circulating in animals, can jump from animals to humans, and can spread internationally under the right conditions. However, standards for field safety are much less developed than for laboratory biosafety. For example, neither the United States nor China have national field biosafety standards, and there's no international guidance available on this subject. A fourth trend are the increased risks posed in the life sciences beyond microbiology. There are important developments taking place in the fields of life sciences beyond microbiology and molecular biology, which are the areas we usually focus on for disease risks. But we're seeing advances in immunology, population genomics, gene therapy, viral vectors, genome editing, synthetic biology, and neuroscience that are raising concerns about the potential for misuse of these new developments. However, the vast majority of research in these fields are not covered by existing biosecurity and disease research policies, which tend to focus very much on a small list of pathogenic organisms. And furthermore, scientists in these other areas of life sciences are generally unaware of how their research could be misused by reckless or malicious actors. A related trend is that we're seeing increasing risks posed by the convergence of multiple technologies, particularly the life sciences converging with other emerging technologies such as machine learning, artificial intelligence, data analytics, and nanotechnology. One recent example of this type of risk is the development of an AI-trained algorithm that identified hundreds of new chemicals that are even more toxic than known chemical warfare agents. And again, there's little to no awareness in these other fields about how their research can be misused in ways that threaten biosecurity. A related trend we're also seeing is the increasing role of the private sector as a driving force in innovation in the life sciences. Non-governmental sources of funding for the life sciences, such as corporations, foundations, individuals, and even crowdfunding sites, are increasing a large source of funding for the life sciences. For example, in 2021, the synthetic biology industry raised $18 billion in private funding, more than the combined investment that industry has received over the past 10 years. The potential risks posed by privately funded research is illustrated by the case of the synthesis of horsepox virus, which is closely related to smallpox. This experiment was financed by an American biotech company for only $100,000. However, privately funded research is generally exempt from dual use oversight in the United States and most other countries. Given the rapid growth of the global bioeconomy, the exclusion of the private sector from dual use research oversight is increasingly a large loophole in our biosecurity. We've also seen a rise in so-called preprint servers. The urgency of responding to the pandemic led to the dramatic rise in the use of preprint servers where scientists can post their findings online before going through the peer review process. And this, the main benefit of this is that scientists are able to get their research results out more quickly. Roughly 50% of all scientific publications on SARS-CoV-2 have been disseminated this way. In comparison, only 5% of articles published during previous outbreaks. But the emergence of preprint servers has removed a key layer of review that could be used to check for security and dual use concerns before publication. And in fact, we've seen several articles related to the synthesis and engineering of SARS-CoV-2 posted on preprint servers, even though they raise concerns about the dual use applications of this research. We've also seen the pandemic lead to an increase in the cybersecurity vulnerabilities at biomedical facilities. And at the same time, the pandemic has created greater incentives for actors to exploit these weaknesses. Between the digitization of biology, migration of biomedical research and healthcare data into the cloud, and the rise of remote working, we've seen it's much harder to protect valuable data than before. But the pandemic has also highlighted the value of this data in this space as countries are rushing to develop vaccines and therapeutics, but also steal the intellectual property of their rivals and maybe even sabotage their efforts to develop medical countermeasures. Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are all known to have actively sought out and exploited vulnerabilities in the cybersecurity of biomedical research institutions and pharmaceutical companies around the world. The ninth trend is we're seeing a much more virulent form of disinformation. While disinformation disease outbreaks have long coexisted, the phenomenon has been magnified over the past decade by the combination of social media, the weaponization of fake news, and the delegitimization of scientific expertise. The disinformation campaigns around COVID-19 that have been spread heavily on social media likely influenced the course and severity of the pandemic in several countries by amplifying mistrust of official reporting and the rejection of scientific evidence by parts of the general public. The problem has become so bad that WHO coined a new term for it, an infodemic. In the future, any unusual disease outbreak or deliberate biological attack is likely to be accompanied by disinformation, which could undermine the credibility of public health institutions and adversely affect public behavior. Most recently, as was already mentioned, Russia's unfounded allegations about Ukraine's work on biological weapons, supported by the United States and other countries, has become the centerpiece of the Kremlin's domestic international disinformation campaign to justify Russia's illegal unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Where Russia has a long history of using such propaganda, such allegations for propaganda purposes, the US and its allies are still playing catch up on how to best counter this disinformation. A final challenge I want to highlight is what I call the biosecurity dilemma. And what we're seeing is as more countries invest in biomedical research, engage in gain-of-function experiments, build maximum containment laboratories, and increasingly view biotechnology through the lens of national security, there's a risk that this research will generate the very outcomes it's trying to avoid. Paradoxically, the more countries invest in pandemic preparedness, especially if it involves research on potential pandemic pathogens and the engineering of viruses, the greater the risk that a biosafety or biosecurity breach could lead to the emergence of that very pandemic that we're trying to prevent. Pandemic preparedness research could also be misinterpreted as a precursor to or as a cover for an offensive bioweapons program, similar to the way that Russia has spread disinformation about the peaceful cooperation that the United States has engaged with Ukraine to bolster Ukraine's biosurveillance capacities. Geopolitics and disinformation could fuel the suspicion and mistrust needed to trigger a biosecurity dilemma that leads countries to take steps to defend themselves in ways that are perceived as threatening by other countries. This is a growing problem, especially in the context of US-Chinese and US-Russian relations, where both sides have accused the other of engaging in dangerous research and leveraging biotechnology for military purposes. So in conclusion, at a time when the global pandemic has highlighted the need for greater biomedical research and international cooperation to prevent and prepare for pandemics, there are a number of trends which threaten to undermine the progress towards those objectives. The key to strengthening global health security over the long term is to strengthen national and international biorisk management, so we can all be confident that research being conducted in life sciences is being done safely, securely, and responsibly. Thank you very much. I'll turn the floor back over to Dr. James.
Thank you, Greg, for that splendid overview and a powerful summary of how innovation in the area of science and technology has created new risk domains and how we always struggle to catch up with those. So thank you very much. And if I can now introduce you to Andy Weber, who is currently a senior fellow at the Council for Strategic Risks at the Jan E. Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons. Just to say that Mr. Weber, Andy has decades of US government service, including serving for 5.5 years as a Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical and Biological Defense programs. So Andy's a great colleague. Thank you, Andy. He's going to talk to us about the knowledge bases and limits, what we know about the Russian Federation's biological and chemical weapons program. Over to you, Andy.
Well, thank you, Wilmot, for hosting this amazing conversation today. And thanks to my colleagues for these outstanding presentations. I'm going to show a few pictures here and take us back a little bit in time. So in 1969, President Nixon ended the United States offensive biological weapons program. In 1975, the Biological Weapons Convention entered into force, making the development of and stockpiling of biological weapons illegal. In the 1980s, as the ink was still drying on that convention, the Soviet Union built this facility, which I'm standing in front of, at a formerly secret city called Stepnogorsk, just over the Russian border in northern Kazakhstan. This facility, which is 200 meters long, was built and proven to be able to produce during a wartime mobilization period 300 metric tons of anthrax agent. In the bottom left of the slide is one of 10 four-story high 20,000 liter fermenters, all in biosafety level 4 high containment, the whole fermentation hall. Just an extraordinary scale of offensive program. They also developed other bacterial agents, and at this facility had a large explosive aerosol test chamber where they tested hemorrhagic fever viruses like Ebola and Marburg on animals. Next slide, please. I should mention this facility, if you were to go there today, you'd just see a green field. It was safely dismantled at the request of the government of Kazakhstan with support from the US Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, or the Nunn-Lugar programs. This is on an island in the Aral Sea called Vozrozhdeniya Island, which was the Soviet Union's open air biological weapons test site. At this facility, about 800 military personnel and scientists during testing season would spread animals, mostly non-human primates, monkeys, over a large test grid. And in a single test, they would use 80 to 100 monkeys, expose them to biological weapons agents, including smallpox, anthrax, plague, tularemia, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, and other bacterial and viral agents. And then they would take them back into a containment laboratory to observe the onset of disease to determine the effectiveness of their weapons. The Soviet Union also in 1988 buried over 100 tons of anthrax agent in 11 pits on this island. And here we were with a team that took core samples, determined there were still viable spores of anthrax in those pits. And we did a project with the government of Uzbekistan to dig them up and thoroughly contaminate them in the early 2000s. Next slide, please. So the Soviet Union and then Russia had a massive biological weapons program. They also had a huge chemical weapons program. They had over 40,000 tons of chemical weapons, including nerve agents like VX, sarin, and so on. Those were destroyed under OPCW supervision with over $1 billion of support from the United States Department of Defense and other G7 partners. And that work was finished, but they maintained an illegal covert chemical weapons program. Bottom right, people don't remember this very well, but in 2002, Russian special forces, there was a hostage situation where some Chechen terrorists had seized a theater in Moscow, and they pumped fentanyl, a fentanyl analog into the theater, knocking out all the hostage takers as well as the hostages. And over 100 people were killed in that use of fentanyl as a chemical weapon in 2002. So we know for sure that the Russian military still has fentanyl in its chemical weapons arsenal. And then the Salisbury attack in England, where these two GRU officers in a bungled assassination attempt against Colonel Sergei Skripal, they used a fourth generation chemical weapon called Novichok agents. And then it was recovered in a dumpster. The perfume bottle that they used to deliver that chemical weapon contained over 10,000 lethal doses of Novichok agent. So the intent of this bungled operation was to kill one person, but using the similar covert delivery mechanism, they could have killed many, many, many more. And when we talk about the context in Ukraine, the fact that they had Novichok agent, that is a smoking gun that Russia retains illegally, chemical weapons, probably nowhere near in the quantities that they once had, but they have the ability still to produce them. And I see it as kind of a produce on demand capability that includes certainly fourth generation chemical weapons agents, as well as pharmaceutical based agents like the fentanyl analogs. Next slide, please. So in the context of Ukraine, it's rather extraordinary. So I should mention that Russia has 3 military biological facilities that were part of its offensive biological weapons program that are still part of its offensive biological weapons program. One in Sergeyev Posad, another in Yekaterinburg, and a third in Kirov. And they have never been open to international visits or inspections, even during the relatively open years of the 1990s. So it's perverse. I guess it would be humorous if it wasn't so serious, that the Russian general pictured here, who runs what remains of Russia's offensive illegal biological weapons program, has been the main spokesman on TV, making up these outrageous false allegations that the United States and Ukraine are developing biological weapons. It's important to note that none of the former Soviet states in Eurasia have chemical weapons or biological weapons programs. And that is verified every year in the State Department compliance report. Russia, however, has never been able to show that it is in compliance with the Biological Weapons Convention. So the very person who runs Russia's top secret illegal biological weapons program is going on TV making these outrageous allegations. And the question, of course, becomes why is General Igor Kirillov, who's head of their NBC Defense Forces, why is he making these accusations? And the United States intelligence and British and Western intelligence believe and have revealed publicly that Russia is planning to launch chemical or biological weapons attacks in Ukraine. And they have a whole range of agents they could use for this purpose, ranging from Novichok agents, which would clearly have a home address in Russia, to something like fentanyls, which are also widely available, even chlorine, like has been used in Syria, that they could blame in a false flag operation Ukrainians for using it. Similarly, with biological weapons, they would likely use something non-contagious like anthrax, but also they could use endemic disease like cholera and other diseases to provide that deniability were they to actually employ biological weapons. And one of the paradoxes of the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine is that as the military continues to lose in the battlefield, the likelihood that President Putin will reach for weapons of mass destruction. And I think it's more likely that he would use chemical and biological weapons than it is that he would use nuclear weapons, although that is still a very serious possibility that we need to be prepared for and do everything we can to deter. So it's a very, very, very dangerous situation. And the fact that Russia continues to have illegal chemical and biological weapons programs is deeply, deeply disturbing given the shooting war that's happening today. Next slide, please. Finally, I'd just like to close with a picture in one of the Ukrainian laboratories in Kiev. This was taken in 2005. The refrigerator freezer behind me had this tray of Bacillus anthracis vials. I'm showing one to a young senator from Illinois who looks a little bit concerned. Biosafety people don't like this picture because I'm not wearing gloves, but I had been vaccinated multiple times for anthrax, so I wasn't too worried about it. But this is one of the public health laboratories that the United States government helped improve their security, their biosafety, and conducted peaceful research on real public health issues. These laboratories played a very important role in the COVID response in countries like Ukraine and Georgia. And they have nothing to do with biological weapons. So the Russian accusations are just poppycock. So let me just close by quoting President Obama, who said that we must not let the worst weapons of the 20th century darken the 21st. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Andy, for that masterful and very, very, very alarming navigation through what the risks are. Only you can give that talk, given your direct hands-on experience as a policymaker and as a strategist. So I'm really grateful to you for your expertise on addressing this particular issue. So with many, many, many thanks. So colleagues, that wraps up the presentations. I now turn first of all to Rebecca Katz for comments. She's a professor and director of the Center for Global Health Science and Security and holds joint appointments at Georgetown University's Medical Center and their School of Foreign Service. Distinguished scholar, over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me today. I do want to stay brief. I know that there's questions coming in and it'd be fun to have that discussion. But I do want to make a few points reference to what's been presented so far. I'd first note that I think like many of us, I wear multiple hats, but I want to note that I'm speaking today solely in my academic capacity. Now, Ian is better suited to comment on the biosecurity landscape that laid out by Greg and thinking about the risks presented. What I would like to do is actually focus on governance of response mechanisms and talk a little bit about what happens if an alleged biological event occurs. So to underscore, this is an if, and particularly like if BW is used in Ukraine or elsewhere. I think frustratingly, very little has been advanced in this space, the space of response to deliberate biological events, really over the last 40 years. We have better technical tools, microbial forensics and advances in genomic sequencing and better methods for sampling and interviewing, culturally appropriate engagement, molecular epidemiology, some of the technological advances that Greg mentioned in the context of concern, but still exciting to think about. And Ian can certainly speak to some of the details in these methods, but what we don't have yet is a robust tested system for requesting assistance, which is step one. Now, there have been years of proposals at the Biological Weapons Convention. There's a lot of nodding that this is a good idea, but no actual change or clarification in the process. We do not have a diplomatically viable process for rapid deployment of investigative teams. We do not currently invade countries for outbreak response, including alleged deliberate use events. And there's no real clear path for making this better. I mean, there have been a lot of efforts underway to try to operationalize both. We have the bio investigations under the UN Secretary General's mechanism for investigating allegations of chemical and biological weapons use. It always just rolls off the tongue. But including efforts actually by our colleagues from NTI, they're trying to push forward some innovative thinking on this. There is, and there really is no rapid response mechanism under Article 7 of the Biological Weapons Convention. We have no answers today on who would deploy. There is no deployable force. There is nobody in charge. Repeat that again, there is nobody in charge. And there's been a lot of work around the margins. We can create standard operating procedures. We can identify and train people who could potentially deploy. We can identify laboratories that could receive samples for analysis and sequencing. And there are discussions around a database for assistance. And we occasionally have tabletop exercises. And there are some draft efforts to highlight the challenges and propose efforts. But I think the big picture here is it's just not done. So if bio is used in Ukraine by Russia, who I refer folks to the latest unclassified non-compliance report that speaks to the capacity of Russia, then what? Who asks for help? To whom? Who responds? It's not going to be any of the permanent representatives on the Security Council. It's not really going to be the World Health Organization. And not many of the humanitarian organizations have the capacity or even really the insurance to be involved. So I think, what does a deliberate biological event rapid response team actually look like? What protocols do they use? What international law governs their actions? Who owns the samples or the genetic sequence data from an investigation? And then could those samples also then be used further in, say, development of a medical countermeasure? And are they allowed, would such a team be allowed to say, one, if a biological agent was used, and if so, who used it? And there's a clear line in a lot of these discussions between fact-finding versus attribution. There's a question about the role of the Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit. There is a role about what the Secretary General would do versus the General Assembly of the UN versus the Security Council. Is there a role for a group like NATO or other regional groups that have developed some of these capacities internally? And then what is the role of the World Health Organization or GORN or these humanitarian response efforts? I think I wanted to raise this today just because we've been asking these questions for a really long time. And again, while there have been dialogues and tabletops in Geneva and Munich, and there's even been an effort to draft something called the BEMF, an International Bioemergency Management Framework, we still cannot say with any satisfaction if there is a viable process for rapid deployment of an investigative team with a chance of answering any of these questions. So I bring this up to say that the risk is real, as has been discussed to this point, and the potential response has a lot of work left to do. I do not know what would happen if there was a use event tomorrow. There is no clear plan. So on that fun note, let me hand it back to Wilmot.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Rebecca, because if there was a moment to introduce a mechanism like that, that has the authority to actually intervene globally, this is the moment to do it. We know what we like as a species. You know, crisis happens, we raise issues, crisis passes, we let our guard down. So you're absolutely right to remind us of the fact that actually there is no facility in the world that can rapidly respond to a crisis we all recognize to be catastrophic. So thank you for doing that. It's a big challenge. And with that, I'd like to hand over now to Ian Lipkin, who is the director of the Center for Solutions for ME-CFS and the John Snow Professor of Epidemiology at the Columbia University Evangelist College of Physicians and Surgeons, as well as the director for the Center for Infection and Immunity at the Maimon School of Public Health at Columbia. Ian is a very well-known specialist in this area, and I hand over to Ian, who will have the last word before we open up for discussion and Q&A. Over to you, Ian. You're on mute, Ian.
Thank you very much, Wilmot. And thank you for Rebecca for that sobering view of the logistics, what we face, what we need to do. And I think it's an accurate assessment of our current status. I'm going to go back to the talks we've heard and try to summarize what I think the key points were. Beginning with the first couple, Severance and Bell. I like the idea of this Global Health Security Index. The challenge, of course, is getting access to accurate information, which is one of the points that they highlighted. It's important to see that they showed us the countries that surround the former, portion of the former Soviet Socialist republics. We've done some work, for example, in Mongolia. I can tell you that one of the challenges there is that they get their vaccines from China and from Russia, and they have strong trading relationships, and they were quite reluctant to forego those vaccines in favor of others that work better because they didn't want to threaten those relationships. A lot of the opportunities I think we will have for access will be through those former satellite republics. Koblentz at George Mason gave us an interesting description of the burgeoning number of high-level biocontainment laboratories and the risks associated with viral prospecting, gain-of-function experiments. I am more concerned about naturally emerging infectious agents, as I think he is too. There is a risk whenever one does prospecting. We do need to have measures that will allow us to have some sort of international standard. I would say that there are international standards for the BSL-4 laboratories, but really none for the BSL-3s. We don't know what goes into them. We don't know what comes out of them. And there have been examples where we've seen inadvertent infections as a result. If you add on top of that what Andy Weber showed us at the end about what's going on behind the curtain in the old days as well as now, we have not only the inadvertent risks, but the deliberate invention of high threat agents. So what are we to do about all this? As Rebecca has said, it's quite challenging because we don't really have international standards, and we don't have a commitment to continued investment in threat reduction. And as we looked at what happened yesterday, things can change very, very rapidly. So from one day to the next, a woman's right to choose has completely changed. So you could see how a new administration would come in and would say, we're really not so much focused on naturally emerging infectious agents as we are on the whole notion that something was deliberately released from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And I can tell you already that as somebody who has talked about this issue ad nauseum for 2.5 years, I've already had to respond to people about this. And they are like, they're like dogs with a piece of meat. They're not going to let go. And this is going to be an enormous challenge, I think, if the House of Representatives goes back over to the Republican side and we have Jim Jordan, Steve, and Scalise and others who are pushing this to the forefront. Because right now they don't have the ability to commit us to meet before them in closed council, but that's going to change, I think, and quite rapidly. So what can we do? I think that we need to rely increasingly on philanthropy to push forward what it is we need to do. There was an announcement today that there's a new climate change school that's going to be built at Stanford by John Doerr. And I think we're going to need to find ways in which we can promote surveillance nationally and internationally with support from philanthropy, because I don't know that this is going to continue through the US federal government. Now, when Andy was at DOD, he was working very closely with Tom Frieden to try to find ways in which they could join forces. But in fact, it's not happening very much anymore. We keep trying to find ways to join the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and DARPA with CDC and with NIH to promote this. I haven't given up on this, but I think it's very important for us to have some sort of ongoing support that we can count on. And we have many people who could step up to the plate and do this. And I'm optimistic cautiously that this will happen. Jeff Skoll has been very helpful in setting up one such program under GAP. Bloomberg has been helpful underneath, with supporting Tom Frieden and others, but we need more people to step up to that plate. Science is moving very rapidly to improve the rates at which we can detect infectious agents. I can tell you, though, that we don't yet have algorithms or tests that will allow us to say, this agent we've identified in a bat is something which poses a huge risk to humankind. And what we never talk about is the threat to food security. Several years ago, I was at a meeting that was hosted by the military that was focused on the fact that there were a wide range of viruses. We talked about animal viruses, viruses of plants, and viral misinformation, which is something that, in fact, two of our speakers alluded to. Very, very important for us to find ways to combat, perhaps the most egregious threat of all. But most of our agriculture is monoculture, and you could see an instance where somebody could introduce some pathogen. It need not be a virus, it could be a fungus, what have you, that would take over and destroy our way of life. So what we really need is ways in which we can respond rapidly and detect infectious agents. We need to focus not only on recognition, but on group-specific tools. For example, drugs that will work against a wide range of coronaviruses or influenza viruses, or that can be used to protect crops or animals or what have you. SARS-CoV is not going away. It is already resident in a wide number of species around the globe, and it will continue to appear and reappear. Even if we see less damage and death, it will be with us for the foreseeable future. And there are other things we need to worry about too. So what we need really is an international force that has some sort of an endowment that will allow it to continuously monitor. Can't be the WHO, because the WHO sadly has to deal with all the interests of the member states, and sometimes it's compromises their ability to say what they know to be true. So this is probably going to have to be some sort of a private organization, whether it's NTI or GAP or something else remains to be seen. But we need to make some sort of a commitment of that sort. And with that, I'll flip it back to you, Wilmot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'd like to just echo and amplify Ian's call for greater investment in this area from wherever it comes within the world from philanthropy. I'm aware of the fact that the G7 Global partnership that I'm also part of is focusing on this question very, very much. There clearly is a need to establish not only global norms, I know NTI is also working on that, but also to have a system of accountability. And he's quite right to comment on what the limitations and possibilities are in terms of using the UN or the WHO for this purpose. So I think it's absolutely spot on. Thank you very much for those closing comments and your summary of the seminar. You did my job for me very nicely. So I'd like now to open up to questions, and I'm going to just use my prerogative as a moderator to ask the first one. I'm aware of the fact, colleagues, that during the height of the Cold War, there was a conversation always between the scientists in the nuclear area, including the US scientists and Soviet scientists, because you're dealing here with an existential threat. And there has to be a conversation, ideally between policymakers or presidents, but if not, that at the minimum in the science community. And the question is there such a conversation going on globally on the question of biosecurity and weapons and materials of mass destruction between countries who actually have a biological and chemical weapons program? It's a general question. I would imagine that everybody would comment on it. But if I can just start off by asking Andy to start the commentary.
Sure, I'd be happy to. We had in the late 90s, early 2000s, an extraordinary set of relationships with Russian scientific counterparts, but that got squeezed off, and by 2012 it was pretty well eliminated as the Russian security services under Putin closed off foreign contacts to those scientists. So the relationships are there, but they're pretty dormant, and I agree, they're very important. Even during the depths of the Cold War, we had good scientist to scientist relations, and on the nuclear side, that helped lead to some of our arms control breakthroughs in the late 1980s and 1990s. I just want to comment on Rebecca's proposal. The Council on Strategic Risks, where I'm currently affiliated as a senior fellow, has proposed such a team, a rapid assessment team, based on the OPCW model. One of our advisors was Director General of the Nobel Prize winning Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, Ambassador Ahmed Azumchu, and he's written about this, and you can read about it on our website, councilonstrategicrisks.org. But he stood up a team for just this purpose, to investigate chemical weapons use. And if chemical weapons were used tomorrow in Ukraine, the government of Ukraine could request that this OPCW team be deployed to investigate. We don't have something like that currently for biological weapons use, although toxins which fall in between could be captured by the CWC team. So we need that team, and it can't just be a roster of people, sort of a pickup game. It needs to be a standing team that has a peacetime role of building national capacity. And it's clearly time for the world to come together and have a trained, equipped, and routinely exercised team to investigate biological incidents, no matter what their cause.
Thanks, Andy. Rebecca, just from the point of view of understanding how governments work and whether there's room in the diplomatic arena for advancing on this issue.
Oh, do I get to pick up on what Andy said, or are we back to like the science diplomacy? I think a little bit of both. Yeah, I think it's I think the global community is grateful for the proposals from the Andy and his team, from NTI. I mean, I think that the people on this call are probably make up a majority of the folks who have thought about this issue, which is frightening, right? And I mean, I remember going to a meeting on the Secretary General's mechanism, and we were trying to bring in the notion that you know, this even moving forward on this idea of investigations, that the conversation hadn't moved on to think about the development of global governance regimes around pathogens and who owns them, and didn't take into account any of those issues. And you sit in this room and people go, where is everybody else? Why isn't everybody focused on this? And it's a little discerning. I mean, sorry, it's a little hard to like take in and be like, what? This is critical. I think many of us who think about this are like, this is a really big deal, and we need to be able to have these capacities. But the community that's been thinking about it has been way too small, and to the points brought up before, definitely under-resourced, and not with the type of political will and attention that would be required to make anything actually happen. I think, you know, Andy said it right. I mean, science diplomacy is critical, and having these relationships between experts, between colleagues, is sometimes the only thing that continues to operate when geopolitical concerns make official engagement difficult. We see that today in all sorts of different areas of the world. So, you know, being able to, in some ways, continue those relationships, in other ways, build them, and having the space to do that is as important as ever, and has also been challenged given just the last couple of years, and you know, all of us sitting in our living rooms. So being able to as we move forward and thinking about reestablishing some of those relationships will be important.
So thanks. So Hayley, I'm aware that at NTI there's a biological risk reduction initiative underway, and so NTI has done a lot of work in this area.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to comment. And yeah, I'll comment on a couple of threads. First, the discussion around investigative or assessment mechanisms. Just the fact that it's been brought up many times is, you know, acknowledging that there's a real gap there between, you know, the UN Secretary General's mechanism and then the WHO's ability to investigate public health emergency through a public health lens. And so, yeah, there needs to be something in place there. And NTI, through our work with Angela Kane, former head of the UN ODA, Office of Disarmament Affairs, are putting forward, our joint assessment mechanism, which is, you know, could be seen as eventually, you know, a component of a future OPBW, but, you know, let's get this mechanism in place for when it's really needed, which is, you know, now. And I could see what Ian was saying about kind of this constant monitoring of threats to really kind of feed in and inform that type of assessment mechanism, and making it more routine, as opposed to, as I think others have said, this like roster that doesn't of experts that doesn't really get exercised or used frequently. So yeah, I think we're all kind of coalescing on that. And in terms of Wilmot, the question you posed around the need for talks, I think, you know, we totally agree, and this has been the tradition on the nuclear side, and there is room, I think, for civil society to contribute to this through track 2 dialogues, and really get those going between you know, scientists. And we had actually a track 2 with St. Petersburg University in early 2019. Obviously, given the tumultuous last couple of years, that has not you know, continue, but it's a important place to pick up and be able to eventually transition to track 1.5 with a mix of government officials, and eventually the hope is direct bilateral talks. Yeah, so I'll stop there, but I wonder if Jessica, I wanted to make sure you had an ability to respond as well.
Yeah, pulling together some of the pieces on just the transparency, but also looking at governance. At NTI, we have the Global Health Security Index that we work with Johns Hopkins with, but we also have the Nuclear Security Index. Both of these projects, and we're working closely with our nuclear team now on looking at what is that risk dashboard, what are trends that we're seeing now that we have multiple sources of data, and using that data for driving some of the decision making. So having just an understanding, and again, this data is built on regulations, legislation, national policies and plans. So seeing just what's out there, what that baseline is, and then knowing where the gaps are to fill. I think that's really important on both the nuclear and the bio side, and having a closer conversation between not only the teams here within NTI, but across the community are really important, because we're seeing a lot of overlap, to be honest, particularly in the geopolitical risk context.
So no, thanks very much for that, Jessica. Any last word, Greg and Ian, on the subject?
Yeah, just to pick up on the point about governance on laboratories and biosecurity in general, we definitely have some challenges moving forward, but the good news is there is some low-hanging fruit that we can take advantage of now. So there is already an international standard for biorisk management laboratories called ISO 35001, which sets policies and processes that labs can use to make sure they're prioritizing biosafety and biosecurity. And this is something that's already been kind of negotiated at the international level. It's ready for adoption. We just have not seen it taken up by a lot of labs, in part because they've been busy responding to COVID, and in part because this standard is very new. And so there's just not a lot of awareness and familiarity with it. But if we had some mechanisms to both encourage labs to adopt this standard, and even better, an international mechanism to audit compliance by these labs with the standard, I think that would go a long way to helping reassure both the scientific community and policymakers and the public, right, that the worst research these labs are doing is being done safely and securely. And because a lot of this standard has to deal with documentation and having proper policies in place in the event of any kind of incident or accident or something else, there would be a paper trail in the labs that have adopted the standard that would help public health community identify if a lab was involved with an outbreak or not. So there's a lot of benefits to this kind of standard. We just really haven't seen a concerted effort either at the national level or the international level to try and get this standard adopted. But that's one of those kind of low-hanging fruits that we could grab onto early as a way to bootstrap us up to some of the more robust governance measures that we've been talking about today.
So thanks, Gregory. Before I turn to Ian, I just want to mention there's one question in the chat I'd like us to address. But over to Ian. Any last word on this?
I was just going to say that the cost for BSL-4 and BSL-3 laboratories, maintenance, everything, their sewage, electrical, security, everything else is staggering. And every time you build a BSL-4 laboratory, you have to be prepared to spend millions of dollars annually maintaining its integrity. So I'm very concerned to hear that you're saying that there are now several being built in Russia. I don't know how they're going to pay for it. I will tell you that even in the BSL-3 laboratories, they're very expensive, very labor intensive. And I don't see, outside of the US and Europe, I don't see a lot of investment, which I would be considered to be appropriate at the level of BSL-3. There are always exceptions, but it is extraordinary investment required. And the BSL-4s are going to be untouchable. So and the other thing is one really doesn't need that many BSL-4 laboratories. Ironically, most of what you can do can be done with surrogate agents in various animal models. And then for the very final step, you may move into a BSL-4. The problem is we're inside of a glass house throwing bricks. We have far too many BSL-4s in the United States. Last I checked, it was over 10. probably need 2 or 3.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that. So, colleagues, there's a question from Zane Grodman. Thank you, Zane, for the question. He asked, will a biological and chemical attack be conducted by the Russians? Is there any indication where in Ukraine it would be launched? Would anybody like to respond to that?
I can start. I mean, that's the insidious thing, is that this would likely be a covert attack carried out by operatives of the GRU or the Russian intelligence services. So it could occur anywhere. It only takes 1 or 2 people with a backpack sprayer to launch an attack with many thousands of lethal doses. So it would most likely be a covert attack. It wouldn't involve munitions that blow up. Think about spray tanks or drones that you can buy at Best Buy as the delivery mechanism. So it could occur against leadership targets in the Ukrainian military or political leaders, like the assassination attempt in the United Kingdom, or for example, the steel plant in Mariupol, where there's a one unit of the Ukrainian military National Guard hanging on for dear life in bunkers underground, and the Russians could inject either chemical weapons or biological weapons into those underground facilities. So that is what's so insidious. And it could also occur in any city in the world, in NATO countries that are involved in the supply lines, because there is a level of deniability. And with bio, because it takes 5 or 10 days before symptoms would even be displayed, the perpetrators would probably be long gone.
Thank you very much. Andy, would any of the other panelists like to respond? That was a pretty comprehensive one from Andy.
Just to add on to a little bit of what Andy already said, yeah, I agree that the Azovstal plant in Mariupol would be kind of the ideal target for Russian use of chemical weapons, particularly incapacitating agents, because that would give them a way to avoid the very kind of bloody hand-to-hand combat they would need to engage in order to take that facility. And we've clearly seen Russia's aversion to excessive casualties. But if we don't see Russia using these kinds of weapons in that location, I think the odds of them using them elsewhere in Ukraine are extremely low, because in many ways, the benefits of these weapons are not that great. These are weapons designed really to kill on a large scale indiscriminately. And unfortunately, Russia has plenty of conventional weapons that can do that. And the risks of using any kind of weapon of mass destruction, whether it's chemical or biological, in Ukraine, on the border of a NATO country or within a NATO country, I think the risks of that are just way too high for Russia. And given the incompetence we've seen in terms of their planning and conduct of the invasion of Ukraine, I kind of doubt that the Kremlin would have a lot of confidence in the security services that they could successfully conduct a covert attack of this sort and have it be successful and have them avoid attribution and retaliation. So I'm hoping all those factors would dissuade and deter the Kremlin from using these weapons, which I think at the end of the day really would make the Russian situation worse rather than better.
So thank you very much for that, Greg. In the chat, there's a comment by Paul Schulte, I think is how you pronounce your last name. And it goes as follows. There's a comment, don't endless blockages of the OPCW process over Syria and the abuse of Russian and Chinese veto power in the UN Security Council over COVID-19 mean that effective investigation, assessment, and mitigation of new ambiguous virus cannot reliably be WHO or UN led. So they must be at least partially regional and ad hoc. So we note your comment. It is a strong comment. I also want, in closing, just to draw your attention to the message from Ian Lipkin, saying that that he's eager to engage with anyone who wants to help with surveillance and the response through capacity building, to make contact with him. We certainly will do. We need all to be involved in this together. Also, comment from Jeffrey Otam that SynBio Africa has also launched the Global Catastrophic Biological Risk Initiative, and collaborators are also welcome. And with that, I want to thank all the panelists and speakers today. That was a very powerful conversation. The first step to fixing anything is to understand it properly. And what I had was the most strong, high-end experts illuminate actually what the details of the issue is, from theory to practice. And so that was useful in understanding, but we do now need to move, as everybody pointed out, to developing a global mechanism to deal with this. And that global mechanism has to be effectively financed, as is all the other finance questions that have been raised, for example, maintaining high-end laboratories, pointed Ian Lipkin raised. So, but we need that facility, and we are capable of developing one. We certainly were capable of doing a whole range of other things. We are capable, and so it's a question of putting our minds together to get there. So with that, thanks. I want to hand over to Lauren Morales-Cando to close today's seminar.
Thank you, Dr. James. We have come to the end of today's event, which has been brought to you by Columbia University's ICERP. Thank you, Dr. James, for organizing and moderating today's panel discussion. Thank you, Harlow Zefton, for your support and for coordinating the History and Future of Planetary Threats series. Thank you very much to our distinguished speakers, Jessica Bell and Hayley Severance on the health security environment across the post-Soviet states, Gregory Koblentz on the evolving biosecurity landscape, and the Honorable Andrew Weber on Russia's biological and chemical weapons program. Thank you, Rebecca Katz and Ian Lipkin, for your special comments and discussion today. I am Lauren Morales-Cando with the Academy of Political Science, thanking our audience for joining us today. We are delighted to be partnering with ICERP to publish an edited transcript of today's proceedings, which will be forthcoming and available online. Once again, thank you everyone for joining.